Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dan McAvoy at the Western Regional Climate Center in Reno, Nevada. Thank you all for joining this edition of the NOAA West Watch. I'm going to give folks another 30 seconds to a minute to filter in, and then we'll go ahead and get started on our marine heat waves topic today. All right, well, we're just past the top of the hour, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. Once again, my name is Dan McAvoy, and I'm at the Western Regional Climate Center. Thank you all for joining the September edition of the West Watch today on marine heat waves. I'm going to have a few overview slides, and then we'll get into our speaker lineup today. So many of you may have been on the West Watches before. Some of you may be new. We're always looking to have new folks listen in. So if you haven't been here before, this is just kind of an overview of what West Watch is. This is a monthly webinar series. So it's hosted by NOAA and the Western Regional Climate Center. And really the idea is to share information about climate observations and anomalies and how that impacts humans and ecosystems around the Western US. This has been going on now since about 2015 in various formats. The way we run the West Watch right now is there are two formats. The format today is on a specific topic. And so this month we'll have heat waves. And then every other month we alternate to the old school style of the West Watch, where I host that one typically, and we do a regional climate update, and then we have briefings from our IUS partners on the coastal and oceanic conditions along the west coast of the US. There is a West Watch website right there, and the video recordings are posted each month after the webinar is over. So as I mentioned, today's topic is going to be marine heat waves. We're going to learn a lot about marine heat waves. This is a very relevant time to have this discussion, as there is a lot of warm water in the eastern northeast Pacific right now. So we'll learn about what exactly a marine heat wave is, how they're observed and put into historical context, some information on forecasting them, and then understanding the definitions and the metrics that are being developed to quantify these events. So we have a great lineup of speakers today. First up, we'll have Andrew Leising from the Southwest Fisheries Science Center in La Jolla, California, and then Mike Jaycox, also from the Southwest Fisheries Science Center, but in Monterey, and then Dylan Amaya from the NOAA Physical Science Lab. So this is a great lineup, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say. A few bits of housekeeping before we get started. We have one quick poll that's gonna should pop up on your screen here in just a moment. So if you take a few seconds just to fill out this poll, then we'll continue. The poll will be asking you, have you attended the West Watch previously? So we want to get a sense of new or returning viewers. And we should be wrapping that up here in just a second. And I usually see the results from the poll pop up, but I'm not seeing them. So I don't know if Catherine has those, or we can just move on. So we'll just move on with the rest of the housekeeping. Thank you for filling out the poll. So each speaker will get about 12 to 15 minutes. There is an option to enter. Whoop, I'm sorry. Here are the poll results, hot off the press. We actually have 43% of the listeners today. It's their first West Watch, and the rest have already attended. So thank you to all the new and as well as the returning participants. So in terms of questions for the speakers, there is a question box that is part of GoToMeeting at the right side of the screen. You should be able to type in questions. We also should have time for brief Q&A after each speaker. And then again, at the very end, we'll hopefully have some time for a bigger discussion. As I mentioned, these sessions will be recorded. And then you'll also receive a post-webinar survey, and we'd really appreciate your feedback on these. And so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I think this was Joe's last slide. I'm sorry for that. And if I didn't already mention, Joe Casola typically runs these. I'm filling in for him today. So big thanks to Joe as well. So we'll get on to our first speaker, Andrew Leising, and I will give him the screen sharing. Or no, actually, I'm going to be sharing Andrew's slides. Let me pull those up. And all right, Andrew, if you can unmute yourself and just tell me when to flip through these.
Thanks. You can hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay, great. All right. So thank you for having me here, and hopefully we'll give you a sort of ghost of Heatwaves present, past, and future for between the three of us. I work as part of the NOAA's California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Team. So a lot of the work I'm showing is stuff that we do as a group. Anyways, let's just jump right in. Right here, you can see a picture of the most recent imagery of the heat wave that's going on. So this is an anomaly map. So everything that's outlined in that super dark black line, that is technically a heat wave. Next slide, please. And again, this almost same image, I just don't have the wind and some other overlays on it, but same kind of thing. This is an anomaly map, sea surface temperature anomaly from satellite. Showing the extent of the heat wave, kind of at its most largest size so far this year. That was around September 1st. It was quite big. It was up over 6 million kilometers squared in area at that time, which is quite large. And you can see it's bordered by that dark black line. And just for reference, there's a little blue dashed line on a lot of my maps. That little blue dashed line is what's called the EEZ, or the Exclusive Economic Zone. And for fisheries people, we kind of worry about that region as being sort of the important ecosystem region. So anyways, just to get us all on the same page right off the bat, what is a marine heat wave? Well, it's simply put, it's just when the temperatures at any particular spot is within the top 10%, so warmer than 90% of all measurements that have been taken for that specific location and for that specific day of the year. And it needs to be over that criterion for at least 5 days. This definition comes from a paper written by Alistair Hobday back in 2016, and just for fun, there's a picture of me on the left and Alistair on the right. Next slide, please. So what do the heat waves look like in this region? So this is just looking at how much area has been covered by heat waves in the same region that was in that last map. So this is just this area of the Northeast Pacific. And so we see here the area over time, since we've had the same kind of satellites, the data goes back to about 1982. And you can see the area here, it kind of pops up and down, but there's really been a pretty significant uptick after about 2013, 2014. If you recall, that was back when we had that big event everybody called the blob. So there's really been kind of a shift, I think, in what's going on with the heat waves in the Northeast Pacific. The other notable events, you can see there's a pretty good tick that's sort of marked in red in 97. Well, that's the 97 El Nino, same thing back in 92, another El Nino. The other tick on here that's kind of notable back in the past before 2014, there's actually some action in around 0405. And that's the one time there was a heat wave that sort of looked like these sort of modern heat waves I'll get to in a second. But it was kind of a failed heat wave that never reached the coast. And what's interesting, Dylan's going to get into this later about how you adjust the baselines for calculating these things, but what's good to know is that no matter how you recalculate the baseline, I've done it a couple different ways, you still get this kind of map for the recent time series in the Northeast Pacific. The big events are still big, and there's still a big change after 2014. Next slide, please. So again, trying to put these things all in perspective, this is just a plot of all the different large, I call these things large heat waves. So I only end up tracking the sort of heat waves that are large, that they're in the sort of top 20% by area. If you tracked every tiny little dot that turned into a heat wave, you'd be tracking hundreds of thousands of these things. So I just only end up tracking the really big ones because those are the ones that have impacts on our marine ecosystem. So since 1982, I've tracked about 218 of these large, what I call large marine heat waves. And I put them on this map to show you how long they typically last versus how big they typically get, just so you can see this sort of distribution. Now, it's sort of skewed, not even really bimodal, but you've got a whole pack of them that are kind of clustered down around, 4 million kilometers squared and under, and only last between 0 and 100 days. And then you've got these big outliers. So you've got the blob on there that clocked in at about 9.5 million kilometers squared, which is huge. It's basically filled up the entire map. Then you've got some other notable events. So Dylan wrote a paper a couple of years ago talking about Blob 2.0. That was 2019. That was a big one. Then 2020 on here was actually quite a big year. And 2022, just last year, wasn't quite as big as some of these, but it was still big, and it lasted actually quite a long time. It lasted more than a year. And you can see I've labeled 2023 already. It's up there. It's the fourth largest by area, and it's already lasted quite a long time. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I found really interesting is looking at these heat waves since 2014, they actually all have a very similar phenology. So what happens is these things are developing the far offshore, and the graph in the lower left kind of shows what they look like. They kind of develop way offshore out there. They kind of build up strength during the late winter, early spring, and then they increase in area to a peak typically sometime around late September, late August, early September. And then they kind of die off, okay? And they've all followed this similar pattern. Even the big event of 2014, the blob, quote unquote blob, it actually had this sort of peak in the late summer and then a decrease in size. Okay, next slide, please. But what's really different is how much these heat waves get into the coastal region, into the EEZ, that little dashed blue line. So you'll notice here, the top graph is the same as before, just showing how big these heat waves have gotten over time for these different years. The bottom graph is showing what percent of that area within that little hatched blue line, what percent of that area gets covered by these heat waves. And so you notice that's where there's a big difference. And so you'll see 2014 is the blue line that just kind of keeps cranking up after the fall. And at one point, it was almost 100% of that EEZ got covered in heat wave during the middle of the winter. Versus typically these heat waves the last 5-6 years, they build up and then they kind of go away and they recede to offshore. But there's differences during the year as far as when and how early they come into the coast, how long they stay at the coast, and sort of the variability within the coastline. I'm going to get that in a second. So next slide, please. So before I do that, just a reminder of what's the problem with these heat waves. Well, there's sort of this great paper that's by Cavol that talks about the losers and the winners. I'm mostly going to say a little bit more about the losers than the winners. But typically what happens is when these heat waves get in the coastal region, it leads to lower overall productivity due to less upwelling. There's typically a disruption of the food web, so that the plankton, the copepods and things are different and they're less tasty. A lot of times these heat waves, when they come in, will be followed by harmful algal blooms, which leads to the production of a thing called domoic acid, which leads to closures in shellfish and deaths to marine mammals, strainings, all sorts of nasty stuff. Another big thing we've seen is this sort of compression of the east-west distance of the habitat that whales migrate along. And when they get compressed up against the shore due to the hot waters, they tend to have more entanglements with nets and more ship strikes. And then the last thing we've noted is that there's a lot of range changes. So fish that can will often shift their distribution to the north to find those cooler waters. Next slide, please. So what is causing these heat waves on the different years to either come into the coast or not come into the coast? Okay, so what I'm basically saying is last several years, we constantly have these large heat waves in the offshore region, but they don't all have the same impacts or come into the coast the same. So what I'm positing happens here is that we have differences in these low pressure fields that work their way across the Gulf of Alaska, and those low pressure fields are driving the wind. So essentially what happens is this picture on the left, you see the low pressure is a little farther to the west, and it has wind going to the north along its sort of eastern edge. And what happens is as the pressure fields migrate towards the east, it replaces that coastal downwelling wind with coastal upwelling wind, the green arrow, with this picture on the right where the winds instead are going the opposite direction. And what happens is that basically both heats up the water in the coast and lets the offshore heat wave come right into the shoreline. So it's really all about these coastal variations in winds driven by these large scale pressure fields that are affecting different years as to whether we get more or fewer heat waves in the coastal region. Next slide, please. So just another example showing that I've done an analysis looking in sort of this grid up and down the whole coast. And there's a lot of stuff going on here. I just want you to focus on this one little spot I'm putting the arrow to, where you can see essentially the blue line is the wind. When the wind changes direction, the red line, which is the heat, the temperature right in the coastline, the heat immediately, it's lagged by a few days, about 2 days, but it immediately then pops up to warm temperatures. And that happens because the green line, which shows that there was already a heat wave in sort of that green box in the offshore dimension there. So if there is basically a heat wave in the offshore and you get this reversal in winds, you will then get the heat right up into the coast. And that happens like clockwork. Next slide, please. And just to show more of that, how these things are related, this is a correlation of that north-south wind vector to, I sort of picked a fairly large but arbitrary box across the Gulf of Alaska. I measured the sea level pressure across that, the atmospheric sea level pressure across that box and looked at it compared to the north-south wind vector. And sure enough, yeah, there's a fantastic correlation, as you'd expect, between that coastal wind and that offshore sea level pressure. What's interesting is that it's a different relationship between sort of the Oregon-Washington coast and the California coast. So it tends to be that if the heat waves are much more influenced off the Oregon-Washington coast by those low pressure cells than they are off of California. Next slide, please. So I went back to say, okay, is this the biggest reason why we have heat waves or not heat waves over the longer time series, back to 83? There's a lot of stuff on here. The main point is that this is looking at this sort of histogram of how many of these sea level pressure driven anomalies in the coast there are. And the answer is, are there any differences in these histograms between 1982 all the way up to the present? And the answer is, next slide. No, there is not a big difference. So we've basically always been getting these sort of low pressure cells working their way across the North Pacific. So what is different? Why do we have so much more heat waves after 2014? You can go to the next slide, please. The difference is the presence of these big offshore heat waves. So basically in this period before 2014, we did not have all these offshore heat waves sort of looming just off the coast. But in the current time period, since 2014, we basically always have a big heat wave looming off the coast. Next slide, please. So this is the end. This is just a summary of this. Essentially, these offshore large heat waves have been fairly consistent, especially these last 5 years. They look almost identical in terms of their phenology. The only thing that's different is how much they come into the coastal region. And so that's all depending on different years, how many of these low pressure cells work their way across the North Pacific. What's really cool about this is that given this mechanism, it's now possible. I go in and I look at this fantastic website called Windy that Nate Mantua told me about, and it shows some decent short range forecasts. And this year, those things were pretty much dead on in terms of being able to predict when the Oregon-Washington coastlines would warm up. And in most cases, those were then followed by heightened domoic acid events. So that was pretty great to be able to have at least that little bit of ability to do some short range predictions. This mechanism doesn't work so well for the California coast, as I mentioned. It's somewhat correlated, but the North Pacific high is probably a better indicator than the position of that low. So of course, the big question everybody asks is what will happen this fall? I kind of see it as, I guess, 2, maybe 3 choices. One would be that this heat wave right now will follow the phenology of the last 5 years, which means it will decrease over the next month or so and recede to far offshore, only to be replaced by El Nino come the spring. The second choice, maybe either Mike or Dylan will get to this, is potentially that heat wave could remain, possibly forced somehow by El Nino, and then be an additive effect to the spring El Nino. But of course, we don't have too many observations of these things interacting with El Nino, so it could be other. And that's all I have to say on that. Thank you.
Well, that's great. Thank you for that, Andrew. Really great to get that background on what marine heat waves are and how we think they form and tracking them. I think I did see one question that we can get to now. This was a question from, oh, there might be a second one. First one's from Ann Mullen, and it says, are the years mentioned the water year or calendar year? And then also 2014 blob extended to 2015, yes or no?
Okay, yeah, those are the years I'm using are calendar years, I guess. So when I have day of year, it's one on there is January 1st. So hopefully that answers that. And then yes, the 2014 event, actually, I started tracking that. You can track it all the way from 2013 all the way through mid to late 2015. So yeah, when I say it's 2014, it's really, it started in 2013. It didn't really come to the coast until 2014.
Great, thanks. It looks like there's one more question. It's kind of a longer question. Alex Tardy, if you want to unmute and fire away, we have a couple minutes if you're able to do that. Maybe I will just go ahead. So this question says, are these new since 2010 is the first question. And then what atmosphere forcing causes, not moves them, as they often line up with the upper ridge, lack of jet stream, and blocking weather patterns that cause drought and excessive land heat. If it's MSL pressure, then it's ENSO is normal. Oceans globally are recorded warm, so the heat waves appear to be absorbing the heat and moving with the currents. So I don't know if you're able to address any of that, or we can think about it and
I
come
don't think I
back
can
during
answer any
discussion.
of that. Maybe I think maybe Dylan could though, but that's
Okay,
way out of my wheelhouse, unfortunately.
great. Well, why don't we have, well, I think Mike is supposed to be going second, and then if we have time for discussion at the end, we'll try to come back to these thoughts. So I'm gonna, thank you so much, Andrew. I'm gonna pass it over, the screen sharing over to Mike right now.
All right, thanks very much, Dan.
No problem, looks good on my end.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm going to pick up actually with some of those questions that Andy left off with about what's to come, and talk about some new products that we've developed and sort of our ability to forecast heat waves in general. You know, given Andy ran through a quick summary of a lot of the impacts that we've seen result from especially the blob, but from marine heat waves in general. And so those motivate this question about whether we can predict marine heat waves to help mitigate their impacts by enabling proactive decision making. So I guess just to start with a punchline, we do have this product now delivering marine heat wave forecasts for up to a year in advance. And so this is a product that's run out of the NOAA Physical Sciences Lab in Boulder, where Dylan is sitting right now. And it builds off of climate models that were already being run routinely. So there are global climate forecasts produced by modeling centers all over the world, but in particular, a few of the ones around North America contribute to something called the North American Multi-Model Ensemble, which is just a collection of these forecasts. You can think about them like weather forecasts, but they do the full Earth system, you know, the ocean, atmosphere, ice, land, and they extend out a year in advance, or say 9 months to a year, depending on the model. And so we took those, the temperature from those forecasts and used it to develop these marine heat wave forecasts. So the latest example taken from the web page is here. This map is just showing you the probability of marine heat waves, with the bright yellow basically saying it's certain, and the darkest shade being very low probability. And so here you can see the signature of El Nino in the tropics here in the Eastern Tropical Pacific. And on this page, you can, so this is the the 0-month lead time, we would call it. It's basically the forecast that was produced this month looking at what's going to happen this month. But you can look further out. So this is now looking out 6 months out to March of next year. And you can see things have evolved a bit where you don't have absolute certainty anywhere because you're looking out into the future, but there's still a lot of regions with elevated chances of marine heat waves, including much of the tropics and also some of the US West Coast, or at least the North American West Coast, and this offshore North Pacific region as well. And so without stepping through all this webpage, just to say that it's there and the URL is in the bottom right. And you can also click, you can zoom and pan and click on individual locations to look at the forecast for that location and how it will evolve over time. We've also just started delivering this monthly narrative to go along with the forecast. So every month when the forecasts are updated, we have this summary of conditions, including how much of the globe is being covered by a marine heat wave, what sort of the hotspots of marine heat wave activity are, and just giving this sort of broad overview. There are some additional figures attached to this. And you can find it on the website, or you can also sign up and have it delivered to your email address once a month. And then, so I wanted, for this crowd, I wanted to talk about something that's in development, which is tailoring these global forecasts, or at least the viewing of these global forecasts more to the West Coast and aligning it with some of what Andy was showing. So this is in development, but I think in the next month or two, probably, we will be able to start producing this West Coast specific marine heat wave forecast narrative. And these are some examples of the information that will go into that. So here are just maps looking at the evolution of the predicted evolution of marine heat waves. That top row is again the probability of marine heat waves occurring in the Northeast Pacific. And this is just a couple of snapshots, October and December of this year and March and June of next year, where you can really see those probabilities ramp up into next spring and summer as we expect the full impacts of El Nino to come to the West Coast. And that green area there is that same US EPZ that Andy was highlighting. And then on the bottom is the sort of predicted SST anomaly based on all the forecasts ensembled together. So again, you can see, you know, to Andy's question, and we can look at this in other ways too, but what the models are predicting is basically the first option I think that Andy presented, which was that the existing heat waves would be likely to fade through the winter, and then as the impact of El Nino is felt into spring and summer, we'll see that increase. This is, you know, also very similar to something Andy showed, but we'll go into this narrative for the Northeast Pacific. This is that metric of how much of the US EPZ is being covered by a heat wave, with you know, up to 100% during the blob, like Andy mentioned. And this is also showing that point that he made about whether you remove the long-term warming trend or not. That's the difference between the blue and the orange here. And you can see a very slight difference, but not a real strong qualitative change. But what we can do now is we can extend this out into the future. So this is, you know, the last 30 plus years, what we've seen. And now we can look at what the models say for the coming year. So in this plot, the gray line is the observed percentage of that EEZ covered in heat wave. So we had a spike in fall of 2022. We're starting to see another spike now. In August, it got up to over 40%. And then you can see what all these different forecast models are predicting in the different colors. And then the average of those models is the black. So again, you can see that predicted decline of the coverage down to maybe 10 or 20% over the winter, and then predictions of spring getting back up to pretty significant coverage of the EPZ. So then, having presented that we have these forecasts, I should back up a bit and talk about how good these forecasts are and whether they're actually worth looking at. So this is one way to look at this. These forecasts, we're producing them every month, but we also have them going back for over 30 years. So we can look retrospectively at how well they performed in the past to get a sense of their skill. And that's what this map is showing. You can think of this as just darker reds are better skill, better forecasts, and then the lighter colors are worse. Where if you went all the way to the lightest colors with the light gray contours, if you can see those, that would be what you'd expect, basically the skill you'd expect from just a random guess. And the deepest reds would be perfect. You're always going to be right. And then anything that's inside the black contour is, we're statistically significantly better than a random guess. So we have more confidence in those regions. So you can see that the Northeast Pacific, the Eastern Pacific in general, but also the Northeast Pacific is an area of particularly high skill for these forecasts. And this is an example looking 3 months ahead. You can then also look at other lead times. 1 month ahead, you can see much of the globe these forecasts have skill. And as you go out to 6 months ahead, you see still significant portions of the globe, including the West Coast still. Although, much of the globe, we lose skill in these forecasts. And there's sort of this spatial pattern that persists with a general decay in forecast skill as you go out into the future. But for the West Coast, there's reason to think we could use these forecasts months in advance. And so I just want to really quickly touch on how these forecasts might be used. And of course, input from people out there on how they might use them is hugely valuable and we'd appreciate. But I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of how we're already putting them into play. And these two examples are related to impacts that Andy mentioned. So the left one is represented by this tool called TOTAL, which stands for Temperature Observations to Avoid Loggerheads. And so off Southern California, during these particularly warm periods, there's higher likelihood of loggerhead turtles being in the region and getting caught in fishing nets. And so there's a closure that is enacted in this fishery, the drift gillnet fishery, in summers when the temperatures are warm and these turtles are more likely to be around and accidentally caught. On the right is a habitat compression index. And so this is another one that Andy touched on, where when the really cold productive waters off the West Coast are compressed really close to shore, then there's a higher likelihood of whales foraging in those productive waters to be close to shore and in conflict with crab fishery. And in the past, we've seen big spikes in whale entanglements as a result of this overlap. So both of these tools have potential to mitigate unwanted human-wildlife interactions. And they've both been developed based on observed information, but we have the potential, or we're exploring the potential to push that out into the future from observed to forecast. And so quickly, this is work led by Steph Brody that's in review and hopefully will be out soon. But these habitat compression indices, you can create this time series basically representing the habitat compression, where really low values indicate an increased risk for whale entanglement. And similarly for that loggerhead avoidance tool, the high temperatures indicate an increased risk of bycatch. And the point here is that when you compare the sort of bluish and reddish lines, you can see good accordance just by eye. And when you look at these statistically, you can see that confirmed. And so the point here is that both of those, the habitat compression, as well as these Southern California fishery closures, were predictable months in advance and some of the times that they've been particularly impactful. And so this is a place where these heat wave forecasts can really be useful. And so we're already in the process of feeding them into the management for these two applications. All right, and I will stop there and pass off to Dylan.
Thanks so much for that, Mike. Looking at the questions, I don't see any new ones in yet since Andy's talk. Actually, here is one from Clarissa Anderson. Great stuff. Mike, looking forward to reading Steph's paper, but do we know history of entanglement before 2015?
Yeah, I know there are time series going back. Oh, in Jared Santor's paper, there's a time series that goes back, I want to say maybe 15 years or something. And I'm not sure about the variability within that time series. I do know that like 2015 and 2016 represented a spike that was well outside of what had been seen historically. But I'm not sure how strong the, I guess, relationship is between this habitat compression index and entanglements prior to that period.
Great, thank you. All right, let me send the screen unless, do you already have it, Dylan, or do you need me to send it over to you?
I do not see anything that lets me share.
All right, now you
Oh,
should
there we
be
go.
able to.
Okay. Show my screen. Okay. Do you see my slide?
Yep, looks good to me.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. My name is Dylan Amaya. Like folks have mentioned, I'm sitting at the NOAA Physical Sciences Laboratory in Boulder, Colorado, actually currently sitting in my house, not in the lab. But I'm going to today touch on these different definition choices that you can make when defining marine heat waves. And Mike and Andy have both alluded to these decisions already a little bit regarding these baseline choices that you have to make when you're defining a temperature extreme, and how those choices can affect the answer basically as you move forward in a warming world, and also how that affects the communication of marine heat wave risk in a warming world. And just sort of to illustrate these decision-making, the decisions that you have to make when defining a marine heat wave, I'm just going to use a very simple example. This is a time series for a single grid cell in Northern California from a climate model that is going from 1980 out to 2100. So it's a future projection using RCP 8.5 emission scenario. And this is coming from IPSL. It shows some amount of warming trend going from present day to 2100. And so you can see this SST change where a value of 0 is normal relative to the beginning of the record, and a value of anything above that is warmer than what we used to consider to be normal. Before I get any further, I just want to thank Mike J for giving me a lot of the inspiration for these slides. A lot of these figures are actually pulled from some of his slides, but yeah, he and I have been talking about this sort of stuff for a while now, so I appreciate his help on this. But when you want to define a marine heat wave, given a SST time series like this, you have to decide, what do you consider to be normal as far as climatology goes, but also that threshold that Andy mentioned. So Andy mentioned that we consider marine heat waves to occur when they are in the top 10% of warmest time steps, whether that's daily data with some duration threshold or monthly means without a duration threshold. And typically one popular way that people address this problem is by using what we call a fixed heat wave baseline or heat wave threshold, where they choose some 30-year period in the past that we have good observations for, or in the modeling world, just some 30-year period in the past, and we define what our definition of extreme is relative to that period, as well as your average conditions, your climatology, which, because these are anomalies, we've removed the climatology and everything is centered around 0 during that 1980 to 2010 period. But what you notice is that if you look at that 1980 to 2010 period, relative to this fixed threshold, these really sharp temperature extremes, these temperature spikes are considered to be rare things, right? They happen about 10% of the time, as by definition they should. But when you live on a planet that's warming in the way that we are, you start to see that if you don't account for this increase in the mean temperature, you end up exceeding that historical threshold for what we used to consider to be extreme, basically permanently by the time you get to 2100. And I should mention that this model is kind of on the upper end of warming trends for the California current system, but it is just one illustrative example that we can use to sort of make this point. But in this model, by as early as 2080, right, this model is permanently exceeding what we used to be considered extreme, and now everything is considered a marine heat wave all the time. So there's one sort of issue that you run into with this sort of fixed baseline approach. So this is something that we kind of want to unpack when we think about marine heat wave characteristics and statistics, and as well as their impacts and the way we communicate those impacts. We're trying to unpack two important concepts. We're trying to unpack long-term warming and short-term, long-term slow warming, and also short-term temperature extremes. And so one way that you can start to unpack these things is by accounting for that warming trend as you're going along your time series. And we call this thing a shifting baseline, where your baseline for what you consider to be climatology, as well as what you consider to be your threshold for determining extremes, is always relative to some contemporaneous climate. So the temperature extremes in 2080 are relative to what we consider to be extreme around that climate in 2080. And in this instance, marine heat waves are always considered rare events, right? They happen about 10% of the time, regardless of which climatological state you're in. And I just want to emphasize that both methods are super important. And one way that we can illustrate that is by this sort of thought experiment. So let's pretend then that the deviation from zero on this y-axis, the strength of an SST change, whether it's short associated with variability, or whether it's long and slow associated with the warming trend, let's assume that those are proportional to impacts, ecological impacts, human ecosystem interaction impacts, whatever. Let's just say that the height of that line represents an impact. Well, in the past, right, we have some current heat wave impact based on some temperature spike, and critters in the California current system, as well as other parts of the globe, they're going to have potentially some ability to adapt to these warming trends, whether that's physiologically or whether they just move to a preferred environment if they have the ability to do so. And so you can represent sort of that adaptation ability through kind of these three curves here, where something that can completely adapt to long-term warming trends is just going to, its representation of normal will always be what's going on contemporaneously. In 2080 is as normal to them as 1980 was. On the flip side, the other extreme end of that are, there could be critters that have no adaptation skill. They can't adapt to long-term warming trends. And so, when they get to 2100 and the world is 2, 3, 4 degrees warmer than it is today, they feel that stress. They feel that extra long-term warming on top of, what they used to be considered normal, which could have been 1980. And so when we think about, the impacts associated with these different kinds of warming, whether it's slow associated with global warming or short associated with these temperature spikes, it often depends on the adaptation capabilities of these different organisms. And so that's one thing that we have to consider. If we look at a deviation, an SST change in the future, what kind of impact might that produce? Well, it depends on the species that you're interested in and its adaptation capabilities. In some cases, that impact may be smaller for things that can strongly adapt, and in some cases that can be much larger for things that can't adapt. So all of this is just to sort of illustrate that, the choice of baseline that you use is going to give you different answers on what those temperature spikes represent. But both baselines sort of give you different but very important information. So it is worthwhile to consider both slow and fast ocean warming. But with that said, you run into some issues when you're trying to communicate the risks associated with marine heat waves in the future by using these different definitions without consideration of how it's being translated to other scientists or marine resource managers or whatever. And just sort of illustrate that for you here. I mean, for a lot of these papers that use this fixed baseline definition, the conclusion by 2100 is that marine heat waves are becoming more intense, more frequent, they're lasting longer, and eventually the whole planet is experiencing a permanent marine heat wave. And that's the headline that can be communicated to the public. And for what it's worth, this is the headline that's in the IPCC. This is like the definition that the IPCC uses. On the flip side, if you take into account that long-term warming trend and you're using this sort of shifting baseline definition, making sure that marine heat waves are always considered to be rare events, they're always considered to be extreme relative to the climate of the time, then the headline is a little bit different. It's more that future changes in marine heat waves are subtle. There are some changes in those extremes, but they're subtle, and they also they're very uncertain across different models. So we don't really have a great sense for what sign of change we might expect in that variability. And it's not important that you understand everything on this figure, but this is just one way to illustrate that. This is just showing marine heat wave intensity in 3 different epochs using a large ensemble climate simulation that goes out to 2100. And then the bottom panels are showing you the difference in marine heat wave intensity relative to a shifting baseline. And in this case, you can see that it's not a clear, it's not always clear that marine heat waves are getting more or less intense when you take into account that shifting baseline. And so when the public is ingesting this information, they're getting all this, these headlines thrown at them from different scientific sources, fixed baselines like, oh, marine heat waves are getting much more intense, prepare for more impacts. Shifting baseline is like, oh, it's not as clear as all of that. It's uncertain, it's subtle. Long-term warming is much more of a clear signal. And so those are the issues that we run into. It's not a scientific question. Everybody is on the same page that both of these 2 baseline choices are important, but it's a communication issue. And so I helped lead a group of folks from the NOAA MAP Marine Ecosystem Task Force to just sort of comment on this communication issue. And so this was a sort of an op-ed that was written for Nature that came out, I think, this past April, where we just sort of laid out these different definition choices and also the communication issues that can arise and lead to real world management decisions that may not be the most efficient for the kind of impact that a manager may be expecting. And just to sort of illustrate that for you here, this is the figure that's in the paper. Don't feel like you have to read every single word here. This is just more or less illustrating what I've already shown you before. But I wanted to highlight these sort of 2 decision points just as an example of what are some real world decisions that people make in response to different kinds of warming. In response to a temperature spike, fishers might decide to temporarily cease fishing during a brief heat wave. A fishery may close briefly during a heat wave, but in response to slow long-term warming, resource managers might permanently shift a fishing ground as the ocean is steadily warming. So when we say marine heat waves are not, changing, becoming more intense or more frequent or longer lasting, that may trigger, a decision response for folks who are expecting, the kinds of impacts that are associated with brief, short-term, extreme warming events. And so that's what we're trying to understand here and better communicate. And for what it's worth, our opinion that came out of this comment was that marine heat waves should only be referred to, or we should only refer to marine heat waves relative to the contemporaneous climate of the day. And that comes from a motivation of keeping extremes extreme, such that we never enter into a situation where we have a permanent heat wave. And then, the definition of an extreme kind of breaks down at that point. If everything's a heat wave all the time, then sort of nothing is, you know what I mean? And alternatively, as I keep saying, the long-term warming is super important from an impacts perspective for many marine species. And so that's not something that we want to lose. We just think we need to call it something else. And so our recommendation for what we should call that slow warming is what we landed on total heat exposure over time. But that's just a suggestion. It's not something that we are recommending necessarily that the community take on. It's more of putting out a term that a group of physical oceanographers and ecological experts could come together and agree on as representing sort of this total warming associated with long-term warming, as well as this short duration temperature spike. So I think with that, I'll just sort of summarize for you here. Defining a marine heat wave is not trivial in a warming world, and that's associated with these different baselines. In a fixed baseline situation, marine heat waves in the future are becoming more frequent, more intense globally, and eventually we'll reach this permanent heat wave state for most of the globe. In a shifting baseline world where we account for long-term warming trends, marine heat wave changes are subtle, regionally varying, and they are very certain across future model projections. I'll emphasize again that there's not a scientific debate here in the sense that, we all agree that both baselines are important. They tell you important things about impacts. It's just purely a communication issue about how we refer to marine heat waves in the future relative to each of these different methodological choices. And I got to say that these definition issues, from what I've heard, are not unique to marine heat waves, and I would love to hear from this group in particular. For example, I've heard from the drought community and the precipitation extreme community that they are grappling with similar questions about baselines, as places like the Southwest US becomes, increasingly dry, is a drought today the same as a drought from 20 years ago? I'd be really interested to hear how those communities have dealt with this problem. But, kind of somewhat unique to the marine environment is the adaptation capabilities of impacted communities, fishes. They may be different than the adaptation capabilities of the impacts that you might expect from things like drought or precipitation with respect to infrastructure or human health impacts, that sort of thing. And then finally, one thing just anecdotally that I've run into when sort of beating this drum a little bit is that it's really hard to change precedent. The IPCC uses a fixed baseline, and this is like one of the main arguments I get when I'm talking to people about what we should be talking, like how we should communicate these different things. And most people will just point to the IPCC and say, okay, we have to do it that way. And I just sort of want to stand up and say it's okay to change our minds. It's okay to adapt and reassess. As more information comes in about how we communicate things, with the ultimate goal of increasing understanding across both the scientific community as well as the public, so that we can ultimately make the best decisions possible. So I'll leave it there. I see we have about 10 minutes for questions. So yeah, I'll pass it back. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Dylan. That was fascinating to listen to. I've done a lot of work on droughts on land, and as you mentioned, you've heard feedback that the drought communities dealt with the same thing. It's been quite challenging, especially when you deal with drought metrics in the future that incorporate temperature along with precipitation or soil moisture. We see these same exact challenges. So I think I'm going to try to unmute a couple people that give them a chance to speak, that have questions or comments that are relatively long, and it might be better for them to speak up. So I'm actually going to go back to Alex, if he's still on the line, and give him a chance. I'm going to unmute Alex here. Alex, you should be able to speak now if you want to come back to any of those questions.
Yeah, thanks so much. The unmute worked this time. The last presentation, I think, answered part of what I was asking or trying to understand, and that the marine heat waves, are unusual, more on the extreme side, and not normal, because I was misunderstanding the first presentation about pressure gradients and how that responds and causes the currents and the movement of the marine heat wave, which is basically what ENSO does. It's a pressure pattern change, redistribution of water along the equator, warm and cold, but it's really normal. I mean, they might be getting more extreme or not, who knows, but it's a normal cycle. So I just want to make sure, in the last presentation made it clear that the marine heat waves are not normal, even though the underlying ocean is warming overall. Because we get a lot of questions, even though I'm an atmospheric scientist, but we get lots of questions about the ocean, so I want to answer it intelligently. So the other thing on my question was, what relationship does it have to, and it just was briefly mentioned, drought and blocking weather patterns in the Pacific. So obviously a blocking weather pattern in the Pacific, whatever's causing that, causes long-term drought, short-term drought, causes heat waves, causes a lot of anomalies over land. But my understanding from researchers was that it also can cause and enhance some of these marine heat waves. And so that's kind of what I was getting at, what part of the atmosphere, because I haven't heard, that these marine heat waves are changing the weather pattern the way like El Nino or ENSO does. I haven't heard that the marine heat wave is like causing the drought or causing the atmosphere to buckle and block. I've heard the opposite, that the jet stream itself, 40 north latitude, for example, the lack of a jet stream or a blocking weather pattern can actually enhance and attribute to some of these marine heat waves. Have you guys correlated that at all? Is the atmosphere forcing and expanding and making some of these marine heat waves larger, bigger, more persistent?
So I can jump in there. So there's been some research to sort of correlate, I guess, for lack of a better word, West Coast drought and Northeast Pacific marine heat waves. I think the overarching conclusion here is that Northeast Pacific marine heat waves are a symptom, but not a source of drought in the West, and that's because they're both associated with these big blocking highs, as you mentioned. in general, it's very difficult for the mid-latitude atmosphere to be told what to do by ocean anomalies. These marine heat waves are really strong SST warming patterns, but the mid-latitude atmosphere is so noisy that it's just hard to like do much more than flux a lot of moisture. So there is some work trying to figure out if atmospheric rivers, for example, pick up more moisture when they go over marine heat waves. Folks like Heatwaves at Hui have been looking at that using regional WRF coupled to a ROMS simulation. And that's sort of on a large scale. I think a somewhat unexplored but potentially interesting avenue here is looking at sort of smaller scales. So thinking about marine heat waves in the coastal environment and how that affects, you know, regional microclimates, say in the Southern California current system where you have a lot of marine stratocumulus clouds. You could have a marine heat wave that's burning off marine stratocumulus quickly, and that leads to heat waves in the near, like land heat waves in the very near shore environment. So there's sort of two scales at work here. There's the large scale blob impact on the jet stream and small scale coastal marine heat wave impacts on, you know, regional climate.
Well, great. Thanks. Thanks for addressing those, Dylan. And so I'm gonna see if Greg, I'm gonna butcher this, Kritzikowski wants to say a few words. He had a longer comment in there. I'm gonna unmute Greg right now. And so Greg, you should be able to speak up if you wanted to talk about your comment. Greg, do you want to say anything? Okay, we'll move on. Let's see. A few more here. Let's see. Anne Mullen, are we able to say now if there are adaptive SPP, and if so, is it due to migrating north?
Like asking about adaptation by certain species, I think that's what that is. It's definitely, yeah, migration is definitely something that is a conspicuous impact of these heat waves. So there's obviously responses going on there. And that's, I think, what when Dylan was talking about the adaptive capacity relative to the land and things like infrastructure, that some of these more mobile species can move quickly. So yeah, we certainly see and expect that as one of the means of adaptation under both heat waves and long-term change. Also for bottom species, just moving deeper is a similar response as a fast way to get to colder water.
Thanks. And Anne just put species in, so I think, yes, that is what she was referring to. Might have time for one more or two more here. I'm gonna open it up for Jan Newton, who has a longer question in there. Jan, if you want to go ahead and ask your question. You should be able to talk now.
There we go. First of all, my thanks to all three of you guys who gave really great talks. And so, but my question's for Dylan. And as you know, I really loved your paper and approach, and we adapted that to Nanus and show both styles. But I wonder if it would help the community to come up with another term to differentiate the two, so that IPCC can continue to use the fixed baseline and use that new term, and then you've defined it for the shifting baseline and use that term. I just feel like that could help our communication, especially with people thinking, oh, the scientists don't agree, I hear two different things, so it's all BS, you know? So it just seems like if we could define another term. So I'll just throw that out there as a plea, but thanks for all the great work to all of you.
Thanks, Jan, and thanks for the question and comment. Yeah, I absolutely agree that it would be helpful to clear up or improve communication by clearing up what we mean by each definition. Right now, the issue is that we refer to everything as a marine heat wave, whether it's relative to a fixed or a shifting baseline. And in our comment, our recommendation was just to call shifting baseline events marine heat waves, and then refer to fixed baseline events as total heat exposure. That's just a term that we landed on. It's not something we're like super like over the moon about. It's just what a bunch of folks could agree on in a short amount of time. I think the risk we run is not being able to agree on something, on a large scale, and then there's not just 2 terms out there, but 25, and then that that doesn't help communication. So I would love to get everybody on the same page and everybody refer to things in a unified way, and we're working in that direction, but it is definitely a challenge.
Okay, well, we are at 2 o'clock now, so I just want to one more time give a big thank you to Andrew, Mike, and Dylan. Those were great presentations, and thanks everyone for joining the West Watch today, and hope to see you again in the future. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.